I was standing at the kitchen sink when the phone rang, staring out at a backyard that had somehow become too quiet for a man my age. The maple tree near the fence had lost almost all its leaves. My wife planted it the year we moved in, said it would outlive us if we gave it time. I remember smiling at that. At the time, I thought she was being sentimental. I picked up the phone without checking the caller ID. If you're listening to this story, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Mr. Callahan? A man asked. His voice was calm, practiced. The kind of calm people use when they're trained not to panic others. Yes, I said. This is Walter Callahan. This is Richard Myers, branch manager at Harbor Trust Bank on Commonwealth Avenue. I'm calling regarding your late wife's accounts. I closed my eyes. It had been just over 2 months since Eleanor died. A stroke. Sudden. One moment, she was correcting a stack of papers at the dining table. The next, she was on the floor, her coffee spilling across lesson plans she'd never finished grading. 46 years of marriage reduced to a single morning I replayed every night. I've already been in, I said. I closed what needed closing. If there's another form dash. Sir, he interrupted gently. I need you to come to the branch in person. There was a pause, long enough to feel deliberate. And Mr. Callahan, he added, lowering his voice, please don't come alone. My hand tightened around the phone. I'm sorry, I said. When you come, he continued, bring your sons. All of them. It's important. I waited for him to explain himself. He didn't. I'll see you this morning, he said. If you can. The line went dead. I stood there for a long time, the receiver still pressed to my ear, listening to nothing. In 70 years on this earth, I had never been told by a bank manager not to come alone. Banks didn't speak that way unless something was very wrong. For 8 weeks, I had been dismantling a life, closing joint accounts, updating insurance policies, forwarding mail, answering polite condolences from strangers who meant well but didn't know what to say to a widower with too much time on his hands. I thought I'd seen all the paperwork death could throw at a man. I was wrong. My name is Walter Callahan. I was born in Scranton, Pennsylvania in the late 1950s. I met Eleanor Hayes in graduate school. She taught literature for more than 3 decades. I worked as a municipal planner. We raised 3 children in a narrow brick house just outside of Cambridge. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable, orderly, predictable, or so I believed. I called Thomas first, my oldest. He's in his mid-40s now, a corporate compliance officer who still calls me Dad, in the same tone he used when he was 10 and afraid of thunderstorms. What's wrong? He asked before I could finish the first sentence. A bank manager told me not to come alone, I said, and to bring my sons. Silence. That's unusual, he said carefully. Did he say why? No. I'll get Mark, Thomas said, and I'll call Susan. We'll be there within the hour. Susan is my youngest, early 40s, social worker, Eleanor's mirror in every way that mattered. Mark, the middle child, teaches physics at a public high school and still wears the same jackets he did 20 years ago. By the time I put my coat on, my hand was shaking. We met in the parking lot of Harbor Trust Bank under a sky the color of old steel. It was late autumn, the kind of morning that threatens rain, but never quite commits. Thomas arrived first in his polished sedan. Mark followed in a dented hatchback. Susan pulled in last, her scarf wrapped too tightly around her neck. Dad, she said, hugging me longer than usual. Are you okay? I'm confused, I said. That's worse. Inside, the bank smelled faintly of carpet cleaner and coffee. Richard Myers was waiting near the lobby, thin, graying, his tie knotted too precisely. He greeted us with a nod that felt more like a warning than a welcome. Thank you for coming, he said. All of you. He led us into a small conference room and closed the door with care, as if sound itself might escape. I asked you not to come alone, he said, taking a seat across from us, because what I'm about to show you isn't something one person should carry by themselves. He placed a thick folder on the table, and in that moment, sitting beside my children in a bank conference room, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to consider since Eleanor's funeral. There were still parts of my wife's life I had never been invited into. Richard Myers opened the folder slowly, as if speed itself might be disrespectful. Inside were neatly arranged documents, clipped and labeled with the kind of precision only banks and hospitals ever achieve. Statements, transfer records, internal notes, paper that looked harmless until you understood what it represented. "Mr. Callahan," he said, folding his hands, "while consolidating your late wife's accounts, we came across something that required discretion." He slid the first page across the table. It was a bank statement, not from our joint account, not from the savings account Eleanor and I used for household expenses, not from a modest investment portfolio we'd built over decades. This was an account I had never seen before. Eleanor Callahan was listed as the sole account holder. The address was our home address. The contact number was her old cell phone. The account had been opened in the mid-1990s. I stared at the page, waiting for recognition to kick in. It didn't. "I don't understand," I said. "I've never seen this account." Richard nodded. "That's consistent with what we expected." "What do you mean expected?" Thomas asked, leaning forward. "This account was structured to remain entirely separate from your joint finances," Richard said. "No mailed statements. No online access linked to shared credentials. Everything was handled manually." My chest tightened. "What?" Susan asked. Richard didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slid another document forward. "This account has been making a recurring monthly transfer for nearly 3 decades." "To who?" Mark asked. Richard turned the page so we could all see. A name. A man I had never heard of. Ethan Rowland. The amount was listed below. $4,800. Every month, without interruption, for 29 years. The room went silent in a way that felt physical, like pressure against my ears. I did the math in my head, slowly, because my brain refused to move faster. $4,800 multiplied by 12 months, multiplied by nearly 3 decades. The number climbed past $1 million before I could stop it. "That's not possible," I said. "We didn't have that kind of excess income." Richard nodded again. "The account was funded through multiple sources." He flipped another page. "Your wife made consistent transfers from your joint checking account, but those alone would not have sustained the balance. The majority of the funding originated from a separate inheritance account opened in the same year." "Inheritance," Susan repeated. I felt my stomach drop. Eleanor's parents had died within months of each other in that same year. Her father from complications after surgery. Her mother shortly after from cancer that advanced faster than anyone expected. It had been a brutal time. I remembered the funerals, the exhaustion, Eleanor's silence. But I did not remember an inheritance of that size. "She never told me," I said. "She never mentioned anything close to that." "The inheritance was substantial," Richard said carefully. "Significantly larger than average. Your wife elected to keep it legally separate." "What?" Thomas asked. His voice had changed. Sharper now. Professional. Richard hesitated. "Because this account was created for a specific obligation." "Obligation?" Mark echoed. Richard slid the final page across the table. "This individual," he said, tapping the name, "has contacted the bank since the automatic payment ceased following Mrs. Callahan's passing. He has requested clarification." "And contact." Susan looked at me, her face pale. "Dad," she whispered, "who is this?" "I don't know," I said. And for the first time since Eleanor died, I realized how much that frightened me. Thomas exhaled slowly. "This isn't charity," he said. "That amount, that consistency, that's not generosity. That's duty." Richard nodded. "Mr. Rowland has indicated that Mrs. Callahan was family." The word hit me harder than the numbers. "Family," I repeated. Eleanor had one sibling, a brother, David Hayes. He died young. A car accident. I remember the phone call. Eleanor collapsing into a chair. The sound she made when grief punched the air out of her lungs. "That was the year," Mark said quietly. "The same year this account was opened." Susan looked up at me. "Dad," she said, "was Mom involved in the accident?" I stood up without realizing I decided to. "There's something you should know," I said. "Something I never told you because your mother asked me not to." They waited. "She was in the car," I said. "With your uncle." That day, silence flooded the room. "She survived," I continued. "Minor injuries. David didn't." Thomas closed his eyes. And she never talked about it, Susan said. No, I replied. She carried it quietly. For the rest of her life. Richard cleared his throat gently. Mr. Callahan, he said. Mr. Rowland left his contact information. He said he anticipated this moment. He slid a small card across the table. I picked it up. The name felt heavier now. Ethan Rowland. Outside the bank, the sky had darkened. Rain finally committed, tapping against the pavement as if it had been waiting for permission. None of us spoke on the drive back to the house. When we reached the living room, the same room where Eleanor's memorial had been held weeks earlier, it felt like a set after the actors had gone home. Familiar furniture. Unfamiliar truth. We need to call him, Thomas said. Not yet, Susan replied. Not until we understand what we're walking into. Mark looked at me. Dad, he said, whatever this is, it didn't start with the money. I nodded. It started with something Eleanor never believed she could undo. We sat in Eleanor's living room like strangers who had arrived early to a funeral that hadn't been announced yet. The rain tapped against the windows in a steady rhythm, soft but insistent, as if reminding us that time was still moving forward whether we were ready or not. The couch where Eleanor used to read in the evenings felt off limits somehow. None of us sat there. Instead, we pulled chairs closer together, forming a loose circle around the coffee table, the way families do when they sense something fragile is about to be said. Thomas was the first to speak. The year matters, he said. Everything we've heard so far points to that 1 year. The accident, Mark said. The inheritance. The account opening. And the payments, Susan added, starting almost immediately afterward. I nodded. Your uncle David died in early spring, I said. March, if I remember correctly. The snow had just started to melt. Mark leaned forward, and the account was opened in late autumn. November, I said quietly. Susan wrapped her arms around herself. So, everyone was gone by then. Yes, I said. Your grandparents were both gone by fall. Thomas rubbed his temples, which means whatever decision Mom made, she made after the funerals were over. After the casseroles stopped arriving. After people stopped asking how she was doing. No one argued with that. That's when the real grief sets in, Susan said softly. When the noise dies down. I stared at the bookshelf across the room, at the framed photographs Eleanor had insisted on arranging by year instead of by theme. Vacations, birthdays, graduations, evidence of a life that had seemed so straightforward. She never told me about the inheritance. I said again, more to myself than to them. Not because she forgot, because she chose not to. Dad, Mark said carefully, did Mom ever talk about David? About the accident? Not in detail, I replied. She said it was fast, that it was tragic, that it was nobody's fault. Thomas looked up sharply. Nobody's fault, he repeated. That's what the police report said. I continued. Single vehicle. Lost control. But she was there, Susan said. In the car. Yes. And she survived? Mark added. Yes. And she never forgave herself, Susan said, not as a question. The room went quiet again. Thomas stood and began pacing, the way he always did when his mind was assembling something unpleasant. If Ethan Rowland is who the bank says he is, he said, and if Mom considered him family, then we're missing a link. Mark snapped his fingers. David had a child. Susan looked at him. What? Son, Mark said. I remember Mom mentioning it once. Years ago. Very briefly. I felt a tightening in my chest. Yes, I said. David's wife was pregnant when he died. Susan's eyes widened. How old would the child be now? I did the math slowly, hating myself for how long it took. Late 20s, I said. Maybe early 30s. That matches, Thomas said. That matches the timeline. Susan swallowed. So, Mom wasn't just sending money to a stranger. No, I said. She was sending it to David's child. Why? Mark asked. Why monthly? Why for decades? Thomas stopped pacing. Because this wasn't support, he said. It was replacement. The word landed heavily. Replacement for what? Susan asked. For a father, Thomas replied. The room seemed smaller after that. And Ethan Rowland doesn't share David's last name. Mark said. No, I agreed. David's wife remarried a few years later. So Mom stayed distant, Susan said. Financially present. Emotionally absent. I thought of Eleanor's habits. The birthday card she insisted on mailing personally. The anonymous donations she made to scholarships she never talked about. The way she watched children with an expression I'd once mistaken for nostalgia. "Dad," Susan said, her voice barely above a whisper, "do you think Mom blamed herself for David's death?" I turned to her. "I don't think," I said. "I know." "How?" Mark asked. I hesitated. "There's something else," I said. "Something I should have told you years ago." Thomas stopped moving. "Your mother was driving that day," I said. Susan inhaled sharply. "She told the police David was driving." I continued. "Said she was in the passenger seat." Mark stared at me. "Why?" "Because she thought it would be easier," I said. "For everyone." "For who?" Thomas asked. "For herself," I replied. "And for David's wife. And for you." Susan shook her head slowly. "Dad, what aren't you telling us?" I walked to the window and rested my hand against the glass. "She told me later," I said, "years later, that they were arguing." Silence. "About something trivial," I continued. "Something that didn't matter enough to remember." She said she turned to look at him, to say something sharp, and that moment was enough. Mark closed his eyes. "She distracted him," Susan said. "Yes," I said. "In the car dash. Left the road," I finished. "Hit a tree." Thomas let out a long breath. "So, the money," he said slowly, "wasn't generosity." "No," I said. "It was penance." Susan wiped at her eyes. "And the inheritance," she said. "She used that instead of our shared savings." "Yes." "To protect us," Mark said. "To punish herself," I corrected gently. Thomas picked up the card with Ethan Rowland's name on it. "He deserves to know we're calling," he said. Susan nodded. "But not yet." "Why not?" Mark asked. "Because once we do," Susan said, "there's no pretending anymore." I sat back down, suddenly exhausted. "For your mother," I said quietly, "there was never any pretending. Not after that year." Outside, the rain slowed. The storm had done its work. And somewhere in the city, a man named Ethan Rowland was living a life built, in part, on a secret Eleanor had carried alone. I went upstairs alone. I didn't tell the kids where I was going, but I think they knew. Eleanor kept her most important things in our bedroom. Not out of secrecy, but habit. She believed that the life you lived publicly should match the life you kept privately. Papers, letters, photographs, those belonged where she slept. The room still smelled like her lotion. Lavender and something medicinal I could never name. Her side of the bed was untouched, the pillow still shaped by the curve of her head. I had avoided this room as much as possible since the funeral, sleeping on the couch under the pretense of a bad back. The truth was simpler. I wasn't ready to face the space where nothing else could distract me from her absence. I opened the closet. Her clothes were still there, arranged by season, then by color. Eleanor never rushed when it came to order. She said it helped her think. On the top shelf sat a box I didn't recognize, pushed back far enough that I would never have found it if I hadn't been looking for something specific. It was heavier than it looked. I set it on the bed and lifted the lid. Inside were folders. Old ones. The kind you can't buy anymore. Newspaper clippings yellowed at the edges. A folded police report. And on top of everything else, an envelope. My name was written on the front. Not typed. Not labeled. Written. Walter. I sat down hard on the edge of the bed. The envelope wasn't sealed. It never had been. Eleanor had wanted me to open it someday. Just not while she was alive. My hands trembled as I unfolded the letter. The paper was thin, old, dated in late autumn of the same year David died. Her handwriting filled the page. Careful, controlled, too neat for a woman writing the truth for the first time. "If you're reading this, then I am gone, and you have discovered the payments. I should have told you everything years ago. I didn't because I was afraid. Afraid you would look at me and see only the worst thing I ever did. Afraid you would leave. Afraid that the life we built together would collapse under the weight of one terrible moment. David did not die because of an animal in the road. He died because of me. We were arguing. I don't even remember about what anymore. Something small. Something unworthy of the damage it caused. I was driving. I turned my head to say something cruel. Something meant to hurt him the way siblings sometimes do without thinking. That second was enough. I looked back too late. The road was gone. The tree was there. David never had time to react. I survived. He did not. I told the police he was driving because I could not bear to live with the truth being public. I told myself I was protecting everyone. But mostly, I was protecting myself. David's wife knew the truth. I told her in the hospital. She had every right to hate me, to destroy me. Instead, she gave me a choice. She said I could help raise David's son, or she could tell the world how her husband really died. It wasn't blackmail. It was justice. David's son deserved what his father would have given him: stability, education, a future not defined by loss. So I used the inheritance from my parents. Every dollar. I kept it separate so it would never touch you or the children. I did not want my sin to stain our family finances. Every month I paid, not because I had to, because I needed to. The money was penance. The silence was my punishment. Ethan does not know the full truth. He believes I help because family helps family. Maybe that is better. Maybe no child should grow up knowing his aunt caused his father's death. I am so sorry, Walter. Sorry I lied. Sorry I carried this alone. Sorry I was a coward. If you cannot forgive me, I understand. But please do not blame Ethan. He is innocent. He is kind. He is everything David would have hoped for. With all my love and all my shame. Eleanor. I don't remember how long I sat there holding that letter. Time did something strange. It folded in on itself. Past and present collapsed into one unbearable moment. The woman I loved and the woman I never fully knew merged on that page. The door creaked open behind me. Thomas stood there, reading my face before he read the letter. "What is it?" he asked. I handed it to him. He read silently. His jaw tightened. His shoulders sagged. When he finished, he passed it to Mark, then to Susan. We stood there together in the bedroom, where Eleanor and I had slept for nearly 5 decades, reading the truth she had locked away behind kindness and routine. "She killed him," Susan whispered. "It was an accident," Thomas said, though his voice lacked conviction. "An accident she lied about," Mark replied. I folded the letter carefully. "She paid for it every month," I said. "For almost 3 decades. She never escaped it." Silence followed. Heavy. Necessary. "She lived with this alone," Susan said finally. "Yes," I replied. "And she died before she knew whether forgiveness was possible." Downstairs, the house settled around us. Pipes creaked. The old floorboard sighed. Life continued, indifferent to revelation. Thomas straightened. "We need to meet Ethan," he said. "He deserves to know we know." I nodded. The truth had waited long enough. We agreed to meet Ethan Rowland that evening. He suggested a small cafe near the river, the kind of place Eleanor would have liked: quiet, mismatched chairs, local art on the walls, no television shouting the news. He said he would be there after work. Said he wanted to talk face to face. None of us argued. The drive there felt longer than it was. Traffic lights stretched red longer than usual. Mark stared out the window. Susan twisted her wedding ring around her finger over and over. Thomas checked his phone twice and put it back in his pocket without unlocking it. As for me, I kept seeing Eleanor's handwriting. The cafe smelled of roasted coffee beans and rain-soaked coats. We arrived early and took a corner table. I chose a seat facing the door, not consciously, but because some part of me needed to see him the moment he walked in. When the door opened at precisely 5:30, I knew immediately who he was. He had David's shoulders, David's dark hair, though worn shorter. And when he looked up and scanned the room, his eyes green and alert were unmistakably my brother-in-law's. He hesitated when he saw us, then walked over with a measured confidence. "Mr. Callahan?" he asked. I stood. "Walter," I said. "Thank you for coming." He shook my hand. His grip was firm. "Steady. These are my children," I added, introducing each of them. Ethan nodded politely, then sat. For a moment, none of us spoke. "I suppose," he said finally, "you want to know why your wife was sending me money." "We know," Thomas replied gently. "She wrote us a letter." Ethan's face drained of color. "She told you everything?" he asked. "We know about the accident," I said. "About your father." He looked down at his hands. "My mother told me," he said after a long pause. "Not when I was a child. Recently, when she was sick." Susan leaned forward. "What did she say?" "That my father died because of a moment of distraction Ethan replied. That Eleanor blamed herself. That she tried to make it right the only way she knew how. And how do you feel about that? Mark asked. Ethan took a breath. I don't blame her, he said. I blamed fate for a long time. Then I blamed no one. Anger is heavy. It didn't help me become who I wanted to be. I felt something loosen in my chest. You work in medicine, I said, noticing the badge clipped to his belt. Emergency care, he replied. Long nights. Hard cases. What? Susan asked softly. Ethan smiled faintly. Because people don't get to choose their worst moments. Someone has to meet them there. I thought of Eleanor, of her worst moment, of the rest of her life spent trying to meet it. I called the bank, Ethan continued, because the payment stopped. Not because I needed the money. I wanted to thank her. My throat tightened. She never knew, I said. I know, he replied. That's why I wanted to tell you instead. He reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope, worn thin at the edges. She sent this shortly before she died, he said, sliding it across the table. Inside was a card. No signature, just a few lines in Eleanor's handwriting. Your father will be proud of the man you've become. Ethan swallowed. She gave me a life, he said. Not just financially. She gave me options. Safety. Time. No one spoke. Outside, the river moved steadily past the windows, indifferent to guilt and forgiveness alike. When we finally stood to leave, Ethan hesitated. I'd like to know you, he said. If that's all right. Thomas answered first. It is. Family, Eleanor had written, does what it can to make things right. We stayed at the cafe far longer than any of us had planned. Conversation moved slowly at first, then more easily, like a stiff joint warming under careful use. Ethan told us about his childhood, about growing up with stories of a father he never met, but somehow knew. David had love maps, he said, loved forests, wanted to work outdoors before life narrowed his choices. He used to tell my mother he wanted a job where the work left something behind. Ethan said, trees, trails, something that lasted. Susan smiled sadly. Mom planted trees everywhere she lived. I know, Ethan said. My mother told me. That surprised me. She talked about Eleanor? I asked. All the time, he replied. She never spoke badly of her. Said Eleanor carried something heavy and never tried to put it down. When we finally parted ways, the sky had cleared. The rain left the streets clean, reflective. Ethan walked toward his car, then turned back once more. I'm getting married in the spring, he said. I'd like you there. All of you. Thomas didn't hesitate. We'll be there. Back home, the house felt different. Not lighter. Not heavier. Tua. A week later, Ethan came for dinner. Thomas brought his wife and children. Mark arrived with his partner. Susan brought a dessert Eleanor used to make from memory alone. We ate at the same table where Eleanor once corrected essays and planned lessons. At one point, Ethan asked to see the maple tree in the yard. We stood beneath it, its branches bare against the evening sky. My father loved trees, he said. So did Eleanor, I replied. Later that night, after everyone had gone, I sat alone in the living room. On Sunday mornings, I visit Eleanor's grave. It rests beneath an oak in a quiet cemetery outside the city. I bring flowers. I talk. I tell her what she missed. This week, I told her about Ethan. He's good, I said. He's kind. He forgives you. The wind moved through the leaves. We're okay, I added. All of us. I don't know if the dead can hear us, but I choose to believe peace travels farther than guilt. Eleanor taught me one last lesson after death. That love sometimes looks like carrying a burden alone. That guilt, if faced honestly, can become generosity. And that families are built not only from blood, but from choices. We are still here, and we are still choosing. The weeks after meeting Ethan did not unfold like a resolution. That surprised me most of all. I had assumed naively, in hindsight, that truth behaved like a key. That once it was turned, something would unlock. That the heavy door I had been pushing against for months would finally give way, leaving me lighter, steadier, released from the effort of not knowing. Instead, nothing opened. The days continued much as they had before. The same morning light slipping through the kitchen window, the same sound of the radiator clicking awake, the same slow ritual of coffee poured and left to cool because I forgot to drink it. The world did not reorganize itself around revelation. It simply absorbed it, the way soil absorbs rain quietly, unevenly, with consequences that would only become visible later. Grief, I learned, does not respond to information. It responds to time, and even then, only when it feels inclined. At first, the truth lay dormant. For several days after the meeting, I felt almost functional. I answered emails, returned phone calls, paid bills. I even caught myself humming once while folding laundry and felt a brief, irrational guilt for it, as if I were betraying the seriousness of what I now knew. But grief is patient. It waits until you forget to guard against it. Some mornings I woke convinced that Eleanor had already been gone too long for anything new to hurt, that the loss had settled into a dull ache, permanent, manageable, familiar. On those days, I moved through the house with a kind of efficiency, as if I had finally learned how to live around the absence. Other mornings, I found myself furious at her toothbrush still sitting in the cup by the sink. Not because it was there, but because she had left it there, as if she had known that one day I would stand half awake in the bathroom, reach for my own toothbrush, and be blindsided by the sight of hers pink handle, slightly frayed bristles waiting patiently for a mouth that would never return. On those mornings, the anger arrived without warning. Sharp, disproportionate. I would grip the edge of the sink and feel something tighten in my chest, a pressure that had nowhere to go. She hadn't meant to hurt me, I knew that. And yet the hurt persisted, stubborn and unreasoning, as if intent mattered less than impact. Susan called me most often. Sometimes she called because she had something to say. Sometimes because she didn't want to be alone with her thoughts. And sometimes, though neither of us said it aloud, because she was afraid that if she didn't keep checking in, I might disappear into myself entirely. Her calls came at odd hours. Mid-morning, late afternoon, once nearly 10 at night. Sometimes she talked about Ethan. Sometimes she didn't. "I keep thinking about the money," she said one afternoon, her voice careful in the way it always was when she approached something delicate. "Not because I'm upset. I'm not. It's just, I'm trying to understand how she carried that responsibility for so long without breaking." I leaned back in my chair and stared at the wall above the desk, where a faint mark remained from a picture we had once hung and later moved. "She did break," I said, just quietly. Susan was silent for a moment. Then, softly, "That might be worse." "Yes," I agreed. "I think it was." Susan had always been perceptive, but this had changed her. The knowledge rearranged how she remembered her mother. It was as if every past conversation now carried a hidden footnote, every memory subtly annotated by what Eleanor had never said. "She used to send me those cards," Susan said once. "You know, no return address, just a few lines. I always thought it was her way of staying involved without interfering." "It was," I said. "But now I wonder how much of that distance was self-protection or penance," I replied. Susan exhaled slowly. "Maybe both." Thomas took a different approach. Where Susan processed emotionally, Thomas processed structurally. He wanted frameworks, categories, explanations that could be examined and sorted. He didn't call often, but when he did, it was with intention. We sat in my kitchen one evening, papers spread across the table like we were preparing for an audit of the past. Bank statements, old correspondence, legal documents I had barely glanced at until now. "Dad," he said, adjusting his glasses, "I need to ask this, even if it's uncomfortable." "Go ahead," I said. "The inheritance, the payments. Did Mom ever use joint funds?" I thought carefully before answering. Not because I wanted to obscure the truth, but because I wanted to be precise. "She transferred small amounts from our shared account," I said, "enough to maintain monthly consistency. But the bulk came from her inheritance, money she received long before we married." Thomas nodded, making a note. "Legally, that matters." "For what?" I asked. "For peace of mind," he replied. "Yours." That surprised me. "I'm not worried about liability," I said. "I know," he said, "but someday you might wonder whether you should have stopped her, or whether you unknowingly participated. This answers that question." "And the law?" I asked. "The law would see this as voluntary restitution," he said. "No admission of fault, no transfer of responsibility." I sat back. She planned that. Yes, Thomas said, very carefully. We sat in silence for a moment, the refrigerator humming softly behind us. She didn't want this to touch you, he added. No, I said. She didn't. Mark, on the other hand, struggled the most. Not with Eleanor's guilt, with her silence. He came by late one night after too many cups of coffee and not enough sleep. He sat at the table, elbows braced, staring at nothing. She trusted us with everything else, he said. Why not this? Because she was afraid, I answered. Of us, he asked, his voice sharper than he intended. No, I said. Of losing us. He frowned. That doesn't make sense. It does, I said gently. If she believed the truth would fracture the family beyond repair. Mark shook his head. I would have wanted to know. I know, I said. So would I. That distinction doesn't comfort me, he admitted. I didn't expect it to, I replied. 3 months after the meeting, a letter arrived from Harbor Trust Bank. Not threatening, not alarming, administrative. The kind of letter designed to be read quickly and forgotten. A request for confirmation. A final formality. They needed written assurance that the recurring payments would not resume. The envelope sat on my desk for 2 days before I opened it. I told myself it was because I was busy, that I had errands to run, calls to make, grandchildren to pick up. But the truth was simpler. Opening it felt like closing something else. When I finally did, the language was dry, precise. The account had closed automatically upon Eleanor's death, exactly as she had arranged. There was no obligation, no expectation, just procedure. She had never planned for the burden to pass to me. I signed the document and mailed it back. That night, I dreamed of her for the first time since the funeral. She wasn't apologizing. She wasn't explaining. She was standing in the kitchen, hands folded, watching me read the letter she had left behind. You found it, she said. Yes, I replied. I hoped you would, she said softly. Eventually, I woke with tears on my pillow and no sense of whether the dream was forgiveness or accusation. Ethan came to dinner again in early winter. This time, just him. He brought a bottle of wine and a quiet presence that filled the room without demanding anything of it. Watching him move through the house hesitant, but familiar, I was struck again by how much he resembled David. Not physically, not exactly, but in the way he listened, the way he paused before speaking. I wanted to ask you something, he said after the dishes were cleared. Ask, I said. Did Eleanor ever seem happy? He asked. After the accident. I didn't answer right away. She laughed. I said finally. She loved. She lived fully. But there was always a part of her that stayed elsewhere. He nodded. My mother said the same. Later, after he left, I sat alone and realized something that unsettled me more than any revelation so far. Eleanor had not been living in anticipation of forgiveness. She had been living in acceptance of guilt. That difference mattered. At the end of winter, Susan invited Ethan to her house for a small gathering. Not a holiday, not a celebration, just people sharing a meal without a reason. I watched my grandchildren listen to Ethan talk about his work. Watched him kneel to explain something complicated in simple terms. Watched him fit into a space that had once felt closed. And I understood then that family does not arrive all at once. It accumulates, one quiet choice at a time. By early spring, the house had learned how to breathe again. I don't mean that metaphorically, at least not entirely. Houses respond to people. They learn rhythms the way bodies do. They adjust to absence and presence alike, though never quickly. When Eleanor died, every room felt paused, as if waiting for her to return and resume the life she had interrupted. Doors seemed reluctant to open. Floors creaked at unfamiliar hours. Even the light felt tentative, as though unsure where it was allowed to fall. In the months after the truth surfaced after Ethan became a presence, instead of a question mark, the house began to settle into something new. Not happier, honest. The difference mattered more than I expected. Mornings became less strained. I stopped listening for footsteps that would never come. The silence remained, but it softened. It no longer felt accusatory. It felt inhabited, in its own way, by memory rather than expectation. I found myself thinking less about what Eleanor did and more about what she chose afterward. That shift didn't arrive as a revelation. There was no moment when I sat upright and said, ah. Now I understand. It came the way most lasting insights do, in fragments, in moments that announced themselves as ordinary until much later they revealed what they had been carrying. One afternoon, while sorting through old photo albums, I noticed something I had overlooked for decades. The albums were heavy, bound in worn fabric that smelled faintly of dust and paper. I had avoided them since Eleanor's death, afraid that the act of looking would either shatter me or leave me untouched, both possibilities equally frightening. But that day, without quite deciding to, I opened one. There she was. Not young Eleanor, not the woman I first met, all momentum and certainty. This was later Eleanor. Post-accident, post-loss, post-everything. In every photograph taken after David's death, her smile was real but restrained. Not smaller, just measured. As if joy required permission she never fully granted herself. It wasn't sadness I saw. It was control, a careful stewardship of emotion. As though she believed happiness, left unchecked, might become indulgent, or worse, unearned. I closed the album and called Susan. She came over that evening, bringing nothing with her but the unspoken understanding that this mattered. I showed her the photographs. She studied them longer than I had, tracing Eleanor's face with her eyes as if reading a familiar text in a foreign language. "She looks tired," Susan said finally. "She was," I replied. "Not from living, from remembering." Susan nodded slowly. "I think she was afraid to forget." "Yes," I said. "I think so too." Remembering, I realized, had become Eleanor's discipline. Forgetting, true, forgetting might have felt like betrayal. Thomas came by one evening with a legal pad tucked under his arm. "I've been thinking," he said. "That's never a good sign," I replied, managing a smile. He sat across from me, the pad unopened. "About responsibility." I waited. If Mom had told the truth back, then if she'd admitted fault publicly, do you think it would have changed anything? It was the kind of question that sounds theoretical until you realize it isn't. Thomas wasn't asking about the past in general. He was asking whether silence had been an ethical failure or an ethical choice. I considered the question carefully. "It might have ruined lives," I said, "including hers. And might have freed her," he countered. "Yes," I agreed. "And burdened others." Thomas leaned back. "So she chose the path where she carried the weight alone." "Yes. And paid forward," he added. "Exactly." He was quiet for a long time after that. "I don't know if I would have been that strong," he said finally. "Neither do I," I replied. That night, I wrote something down for the first time since Eleanor died. Not a letter, just a sentence. "There are mistakes you confess, and mistakes you repay." I didn't know which was braver. Ethan called me later that week. "I wanted to tell you something," he said. "I finally understand why Eleanor kept her distance." "Why?" I asked. "She didn't want me to love her," he said. "Because love would have complicated forgiveness." I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. Love does that. It entangles. It introduces imbalance. Forgiveness becomes muddied when affection demands reciprocity. Eleanor had understood that. She had chosen clarity over comfort. At church the following Sunday, the sermon was about legacy. Not wealth, not reputation. Impact. The pastor said, "We are remembered not for what we intended, but for what remains." I thought of Eleanor's quiet payments, her anonymous cards, the life she had helped build without stepping into it. I thought of David, and of Ethan standing beneath the maple tree, looking up as if searching for something he could not name. Later that afternoon, Mark joined me in the yard. "Do you ever wish she told you?" he asked. "Yes," I said honestly, "even knowing it would have hurt. Especially because it would have hurt," I replied. "Marriage isn't about comfort. It's about truth." He nodded. "But," I continued, "I understand why she didn't." "That's not the same as approval," Mark said. "No," I agreed. "It's compassion." As spring settled in, the maple tree began to bud again. Eleanor would have loved that. I realized then that forgiveness is not a single act. It is a discipline, something practiced daily, quietly, without applause. Eleanor practiced guilt that way. We were learning to practice grace. The invitation arrived in late spring. Heavy paper, cream-colored, simple lettering. Ethan and Sarah. The names sat side by side without flourish, without excess. Eleanor would have approved of that. She believed meaning didn't need decoration. The ceremony was planned for early summer, in a small botanical garden outside the city. Open air, trees, water nearby. Ethan had mentioned it casually once, as if it were just another logistical detail. But when I read the invitation again, I understood the choice more clearly. He was surrounding the beginning of his marriage with living things. Growth, not memory. The weeks leading up to the wedding were busy in a way that felt unfamiliar after so much quiet. Susan helped Sarah with small arrangements. Mark offered to handle music logistics. Thomas reviewed contracts he had no obligation to review, simply because that was how he loved by making sure nothing went wrong. And me? I watched. I watched Ethan move through our family with a careful respect that never felt distant. He asked before he assumed, listened more than he spoke. When my grandchildren climbed onto his lap without invitation, he looked briefly startled, then smiled as if he had been waiting for something like that his entire life. One evening, a week before the wedding, Ethan asked if we could walk. Just the two of us. We took the familiar path through the neighborhood, the one Eleanor and he used to walk after dinner when our knees still cooperated. I've been thinking about something, he said. So have I replied. That seems to be the theme lately. He smiled, then grew serious. I don't know where I fit, he said. In your family. In her story. I stopped walking. You fit because you're here, I said. Not because of how you arrived. He nodded, but didn't look convinced. She gave me everything, he said, and yet she never let me know her. That was her choice, I replied. Not your loss. He considered that. Do you ever wish, he asked, that she had chosen differently? I thought of Eleanor in the kitchen, of her measured smile, of the letter. Yes, I said. And no. He waited. Yes, because intimacy matters. And no, because she did what she believed would hurt the fewest people. That doesn't mean it was right, he said. No, I agreed. But it was hers. The day of the wedding dawned clear and warm. The garden was quiet when we arrived, dew still clinging to the leaves. White chairs lined the aisle. Soft music drifted through the air. Birds filled in the gaps. As Ethan stood at the front, adjusting his jacket nervously, I saw David in him again, not in the face this time, but in the posture. The way he squared his shoulders as if preparing to step into something larger than himself. When Sarah appeared, radiant and steady, the entire space seemed to lean forward. I found myself crying without warning. Not from sadness, from continuity, from a knowledge that something broken long ago had not ended everything, that it had echoed forward, reshaped, redeemed in ways Eleanor never lived to see. After the ceremony, Ethan found me near the edge of the garden. Will you walk with me? He asked. To where? To the start, he said. Down the aisle. I took his arm, and together, we walked toward a future that included the past without being owned by it. The wedding ended the way all good weddings do. Not with spectacle, but with exhaustion. Laughter softened by long conversations. Shoes kicked off under tables. Promises already beginning to age into responsibility. That night, back home, I sat alone in the living room with the windows open. Summer air moved through the house, warm and slow, carrying distant sounds of traffic and life continuing without ceremony. I thought of Eleanor, not as she was at the end, fragile and quiet, but as she had been in the middle of things. Standing in this room, hands on her hips, evaluating furniture placement like it was a moral decision. Laughing at her own jokes when no one else did. Falling asleep halfway through movies she insisted on choosing. I realized something then that I hadn't allowed myself to admit before. Eleanor never expected absolution. Not from me. Not from Ethan. Not from God. She wasn't living toward forgiveness. She was living toward balance. Every month, every quiet transfer, every unsigned card was her way of saying, I cannot undo what I broke, but I can keep it from breaking someone else. That distinction mattered. The following Sunday, I went to the cemetery as I always do. The oak tree above Eleanor's grave was full now, leaves catching the light. I sat on the bench and spoke out loud, because silence no longer felt appropriate. You have liked the wedding, I told her. It was simple, thoughtful, honest. The wind moved gently through the branches. Ethan is happy, I continued. He's building a life. A good one. You gave him that. I paused. I was angry with you, I admitted. For the lie. For the distance. For deciding alone what should have been shared. I took a breath. But I understand you now. Understanding didn't erase the pain. It didn't rewrite the past. But it softened the sharpest edges. I forgive you, I said. Not because you were perfect, but because you were human, and because you tried to make something good out of something terrible. I sat there a long time after that, saying nothing. As weeks turned into months, Ethan became woven into the fabric of our lives. Not loudly, not insistently, just present. He called on birthdays, showed up for ordinary dinners, listened more than he spoke. Family, I learned, is not declared. It's practiced. One evening, Susan asked me a question I had been expecting. If Mom were alive, she said, do you think she would have told us eventually? I thought about it carefully. Yes, I said, but only when she believed we were strong enough to hold it. And were we? She asked. I smiled sadly. We are now. I am an old man. I've lived long enough to know that most lives are not shaped by single moments, but by what we do afterward, by how we respond to the damage we cause and the damage we inherit. Eleanor caused harm in one careless moment. Then she spent the rest of her life trying to repair what she could. She didn't do it perfectly. She didn't do it publicly. She didn't even do it bravely. But she did it consistently. And sometimes consistency is the truest form of love. So when I think back to that phone call from the bank manager, the warning not to come alone, I finally understand what he meant. Some truths are too heavy for one person. They require witnesses, family, time. They require us to sit together in discomfort until meaning emerges. Eleanor's secret was never meant to destroy us. It was meant to protect. And now, with the truth spoken, with forgiveness chosen, with the past acknowledged but no longer in control, I can say this with certainty. We're not defined by the worst thing we've done. We are defined by what we do next.